Hello and welcome everyone to this pop-up course on COVID-19 and the weapons of mass destruction. It's a pleasure to have all of you join me today. My name is WPS Sidhu. I have the privilege, the pleasure, and the honor of leading the UN specialization at the Center for Global Affairs School of Professional Studies, New York University. And I also have been working on weapons of mass destruction issues perhaps for the last 30 years. And I'm delighted to present this course, this mini course to you over the next perhaps 20 minutes or so. And then I very much welcome your questions and comments if you might have any. So to start with, it's a question that I've posed at the start of almost every course, and this is no exception. And I know there's already been a discussion on Twitter and LinkedIn related to this event as well. Why should we have a course on weapons of mass destruction? Or indeed, should we have a course on COVID-19 and weapons of mass destruction? Spoiler alert, the short answer is yes. But I will try and prove why I think it is strongly justified with pointing out three elements for you. Number one, we need to think about three kinds of challenges which relate to weapons of mass destruction that we need to address today. The first is the threat which comes from states. Now, many of you and states which are members already of the non-proliferation regime or of various WMD regimes. So, for example, here you have an image of the Russian missile, which actually broke the back, as it rightly says, of the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, which has been in the news very much. You may also have heard of China unveiling a lot of new missiles and nuclear weapons around the time of the 70th anniversary, the DF-17 and the DF-41. But you may have heard less or may remember less that the previous US President, Donald Trump, has called for new nuclear warheads and two types of missiles, which, by the way, have still not been canceled by the Biden administration. And if that wasn't worrisome enough, the British have also announced that they're going to increase their arsenal. And even though they've got a lot of criticism, they are in fact going ahead with it. So the first threat we face is from states already with nuclear weapons, which are recognized as the official, if you like, or the formal nuclear weapon states. The second set of threats, which you may be more familiar with, comes from countries which are outside of this regime. So there you have Kim Jong-un of North Korea examining his what is claimed to be a hydrogen bomb, and below that you have the Kaesong-15 intercontinental ballistic missile as well. You may also be following and be aware of the chemical weapons attacks in Syria, which have been going on since 2013. And many of them have, it's still very difficult to attribute them to who they are. And this is a chart here by the Human Rights Watch, which is trying to identify them as well. And third, I'm very sure all of you have heard of the situation related to Iran, even though Iran does not possess at the moment and is not likely to possess a nuclear weapon for at least decades to come. And there you have, as you know, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action falling apart, and also attacks on the Natanz plant below, which is the centrifuge plant as well. But then you also have what you might call the non-state actor networks or even terrorist groups who are seeking to use nuclear weapons. And one of the early warnings came soon after the events of 9/11, when the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists put out this question, hypothetical question, saying, can a nuclear 9/11 happen? That thought has not gone away. and it still remains very real and present. And given the insurrection that we saw in Washington, D.C. on the Capitol on the 6th of January, there's also a possibility of folks in the military trying to access these weapons, which would be relatively easier for them for nefarious purposes. So with these three reasons, I would argue that there's a very strong case for having a course on weapons of mass destruction, and which is why CGA offers one. Our course, and before I get to the course, I just want to also talk about other institutions which also recognize the continued threat that weapons of mass destruction pose for the global well-being. This is a chart put out by the World Economic Forum at the beginning of Davos, the meeting in Davos. It's called the Global Risks Report. And as you will see, for the last 6 years, weapons of mass destruction remain among the top 5 threats globally in terms of impact. Even in 2020, when climate action failure was at the height of it, weapons of mass destruction was number 2. Also, last year, even as the pandemic was just starting to rage, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which has this doomsday clock, which says that at midnight, you're going to have Armageddon, actually moved its clock to the closest it's ever been to midnight, just 100 seconds. And one of the reasons for that was this concern about nuclear threats and the possibility of nuclear conflict as well. So against that background and backdrop, our course offers the following topics and covers the following topics. It looks at non-proliferation, disarmament, and arms control, and its relationship with international security. It examines chemical weapons and, of course, what's happening in Syria, biological weapons, also linking it to COVID-19, nuclear and radiological weapons, missiles, and then we move to looking at the nuclear non-proliferation regime as to what exactly are its components, how effectively it's working and not working. Then we move on to very specific case studies, and we examine at least the countries listed here, the United States, Russia, South Africa, which often gets overlooked, but also Iran and North Korea. We then move to looking at weapons of mass destruction terrorism and what have been the efforts until now to prevent it and how effective they've been. Last but not the least, we turn to the emerging non-proliferation and disarmament challenges that we are faced with. Let me now move to the third and perhaps the most important part of this pop-up course, which is to talk about COVID-19 and weapons of mass destruction, which really is part of this lecture, but it's a very abbreviated one. So what I intend to do is I'm going to ask the key question and try to answer it to see whether COVID-19 is indeed a biological weapon, the result of an accident, or is it in fact a natural disease? I then want to talk a little bit about the biological risk spectrum. And if there's one thing you take away from this presentation, it's this that I would like you to do. I'll very quickly run over what has been the efforts to manage biological weapons over history. And then what has been the 3 challenges that we face with bioweapons today. The first, the possibility of deliberate use by states and armed non-state actors. Second, misuse of biotechnology with unintended consequences. Third, accidents involving biological and toxin material, particularly in laboratories. And last but not the least, what can we possibly do about all of this? Okay, so the question, is COVID-19 a weapon? I think can be answered quite simply. Again, the short answer is no, because countries like China, Iran, and Russia, which have claimed that it was in fact a US bioweapon, have not provided any evidence and proof at all. Okay. Instead, what is become quite a heated debate is whether COVID-19 was in fact the result of an accident or misuse. Michael Pompeo, the former Secretary of State, said there was significant evidence, but never provided any, that it came from this lab in Wuhan. Redfield, who was the former head of the CDC, also made a similar claim as well, saying that it originated from this lab in Wuhan, right? But there is an equally significant amount of scientists who really believe the consensus that it is a natural virus, but there is really no conclusive evidence. And this news report, or this report by Milton Leitenberg in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, basically sums it up, saying at present, the origins of SARS-CoV-2 remain unknown, right? The possibility that it came out of an accident from a lab cannot be ruled out, but it cannot be said with any degree of certainty either. Now, I talked about the biological risk spectrum. And until now, most of the bioweapons that we know of also occur as natural diseases. Okay, so this spectrum shows you what are the kind of biothreats that we face today. First, there are many, almost all kinds of diseases which have been weaponized, also emerge as natural disease outbreaks, right? Then you can have unintended consequences, and I'll go into some detail about what some of these might look like. There could also be accidents that we've been talking about. Next, there may be an element of negligence on the part of institutions or laboratories which are dealing with this biomaterial. But you could also have instances of vandalism and sabotage. We know, for example, the anthrax attacks in the US following 9/11 were in fact traced back to some disgruntled employees within the bio industry in the US, but not directly specified. And last but not the least, you may have a deliberate use of bioweapons by either state actors or non-state actors. So this is an important spectrum for us to keep in mind. But the reason I share this spectrum is the following. If you are concerned about the natural disease outbreak of like COVID-19, for example, as the World Health Organization is, then this is really what is your area of interest. However, if you're equally concerned about the use of bioweapons, then the Biological Weapons Convention comes into play, because they really are concerned with this aspect of the spectrum. Now, the reason I share the spectrum is twofold. Number one, I know there are already issues that we all are having with the World Health Organization handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'll come to that in a minute. But there's even less progress in the Bioweapons Convention area. And that already shows you how, if we cannot even manage COVID-19 collectively, even though there is a broad consensus that it is a natural disease, then we're even likely to do much worse when it's in fact a deliberate use of bioweapons. And last but not the least, there's also this overlap. So unless there's very clear coordination, there can be even more problems in trying to deal with this. And that's why Kofi Annan, as early as 2006, basically said we need to think of this as an interlinked array of problems. And Richard Guthrie of the Bioweapon Prevention Project also underlines that the best way to deal with deliberately caused disease is to have an effective understanding of the responses to naturally occurring diseases. And there, I'm afraid, we haven't done very, very well. So the first effort to try and deal with bioweapons was the Geneva Protocol. I'm just going to run through this very, very quickly in the interest of time. But that tried very hard to ban bioweapons. However, it was not very successful. And we have the notorious Unit 731, headed by Surgeon General Shiro Ishii of Japan, who during World War II, between 1932 and 1942, carried out a large number of experiments and even attacks on Chinese cities, on Chinese cities, and Chinese and indeed some Japanese soldiers as well, using bioweapons as well. However, the next big effort to try and deal with bioweapons comes only in 1969, when, after carrying out unilateral disarmament of the offensive biological and chemical weapons of the United States, the US then started to push forward for this idea of a biological and toxin weapons convention, or simply the BWC. There was a reasonably long negotiation, and in 1975, the Bioweapon Convention entered into force and was signed by Richard Nixon's successor, Gerald Ford. Now, the bioweapons mandate, very briefly, is, and I'm not going to go into this in detail, is number one, never to acquire, retain, or retain biological weapons, not to transfer or assist in any way with biological weapons, take national measures to deal with, to make sure that biological weapons are not being developed surreptitiously. And number four, this is very important, is one we'll come back to later on, to consult bilaterally and multilaterally to solve problems with the implementation of the Bioweapons Convention. And last, and there's also the provision to allow the UN Security Council to investigate and to assess state parties which are facing biological weapon threats as well. There are a few strengths which are very clear. It's a comprehensive ban. It sets a very strong international norm. There are no exceptions. No countries can say we opt out. And it does so far take into account future developments. But there are several weaknesses. Number one, no organization. Number two, no verification or compliance, only confidence building measures. Number three, no systemic assessment of the needs of a system. And there's an uneven national implementation and no mechanism for investigating alleged violations either, right? And they're only looking at state-sponsored bioweapon programs, not bioterrorism. Now, there have been several uses of bioweapons after this treaty came into force, but most of them have involved non-state actors, right? There's also the Secretary General's mechanism, the UN Secretary General's mechanism, which empowers the Secretary General to carry out investigations of the use of bio and chemical weapons. But so far, it's only been used in the case of chemical weapons, not bioweapons so far, and has not been used to instigate attacks against healthcare, which is what you might argue COVID-19 has been. Now, as I said, there is no verification mechanism of the Bioweapons Convention. And so, and also states are not beholden to provide information about the bioweapons holding. So the compromise was that they would provide voluntarily as a confidence building measure that if they had any kind of programs that could lead on to or have a potential bioweapon capability. And this map shows you that of the 183 member states of the Bioweapons Convention, only 82 have submitted confidence building measures. So there's a lot more material out there than we are even aware of formally. What about use by non-state actors? This was highlighted very much by Secretary General, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who talked about that even though COVID-19 is not a bioweapon, the way that it is unfolded may actually give ideas to non-state actors how to use this in some future attack. And this is not out of the ordinary because the FBI Director Christopher Wray in February last year already identified that some white supremacist groups may actually be interested in acquiring this virus for the kind of purposes that Antonio Guterres warned us against. And the fact that we saw the 6th of January insurrection shows that this is not really out of the realm of possibility and something that we need to keep in mind, right? But I want to turn to a few cases which are particularly even more worrying. So some of you may remember that a few years ago, there was the H5N1 Bird Flu virus, which was deadly to humans, but it was not transmitted directly. So this group of scientists, Ron Forchier in Netherlands, carried out an experiment to see how the H5N1 could be transmitted from birds to animals, right? What might the pathway be? And then, of course, like good scientists, they wanted to publish their findings. There was a big debate about it. And normally, if this was a normal class, I would pause dramatically and ask you and say, what do you think was the result? And the result, unfortunately, was that the paper was published, okay? So this is just one instance of how we need to see, that knowledge is used for the end purpose that it is. There's a similar threat with CRISPR, which is this bio tool, which is incredibly useful for lots of benign purposes, but it can also be used for a lot of malignant purposes as well. And one instance of that was by this scientist in China, He Jiankui, who is a researcher at the Southern University of Science and Technology in Shenyang, who used CRISPR to create a gene-edited twins. The problem was that this was done without any oversight, any overview, and even the consent of the parents seems to have been a bit doubtful, but certainly outside of the realm of international possibilities, right? So what the point I'm making here is that there's a lack of global standards. And according to one study, there are over 3,000 high containment biological weapon laboratories which deal with a lot of deadly and nasty pathogens. But the problem is that no one agency tracks the number of these labs, right? And therefore, no agency is responsible for the risks associated with proliferation of these labs. And to make matters worse, there have been any number of accidents, and a report again in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists in 2019 identified some of the major accidents that have happened. So for example, over this period from 2009 to 2015, 79.3%, almost 80% of incidents involved human error. A government accountability organization office report of the US actually also showed how a US lab had actually sent 200 samples of anthrax, which they thought were inert, but actually active, to 200 labs worldwide. And last but not the least, the UK hand and foot mouth disease in 2007 also originated out of contaminated wastewater. So how do we move forward from all of these crises that we've talked about, states, non-state, accidents, and inadvertent use as well, right? So a couple of scholars at the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, James Reville and John Borey, have suggested building and empowering mechanisms for collaborative coordination of disease surveillance, which, by the way, we've done very, very poorly, given what we now know of COVID-19. Second, to widen and deepen the UN Secretary General's mechanism to cover not only alleged use, but also disease use, and to strengthen, thirdly, international prohibition against biological weapons, right? We are on the cusp of the 9th Biological Weapons Review Conference, which is going to be held this year. And this may be an opportunity to enhance consultation and cooperation, improve resistance and response, try to move towards a verification regime, build a network approach, and also think about new approaches, like, for example, a worldwide registry, which is very common in the medical field, to also use that in the bio field as well. Now, literally, in anticipation of our pop-up course today, the WHO had an independent panel for pandemic preparedness and response just released its reports. This was headed by President Sirleaf former President Sirleaf of Liberia, and Helen Clark, of a former Prime Minister of New Zealand, and they came up with the following 4 recommendations. There are others, but these are the 4 primary ones. Number 1, setting up a global health threats council, almost like a security council for global health threats. Number 2, funding an international pandemic financing facility. Number 3, empowering the World Health Organization to override national governments. Number 4, making the international health regulation action far more responsive. Now, this is obviously very ideal, but let me conclude by saying what might be the challenges in trying to have this implemented. First of all, we will need to have some kind of a détente or understanding between China and the US, particularly on this issue, to see that we can move forward. Second, We may also need to look for other other non-hegemonic actors, both from the global north and the south, who are willing to work with industry, academia, and others to enhance cooperation, strengthen prohibition, and bioweapons. But I think the inability to make progress during and even after COVID-19 will really leave the world far more vulnerable to the possibility of a COVID-based or a coronavirus-based bioattack, either by a state or non-state actor. And that really is a risk that we cannot take, because it threatens global health, economic, social, and political catastrophe. Our choices have never been starker, and the need for action is right now. Thank you very much. Let me stop there and see if there are any questions that you might have for me. So in the interest of time, and I see that there's only one question at the moment, so I will let me start with that. Won't bio and chem weapons always be a tool of the powerful? Unless the powerful states police the system, how will they ever be actually banned? Since we see powerful states globally or regionally using them without penalty, is the danger of hypocrisy debilitating? It's a very good question, but let me just sort of qualify that a little bit. I think many of the states that you've talked about, and obviously, you know, in the context of in the context of powerful states, I would argue that almost all of them have voluntarily given up chemical weapons, because in fact they find chemical weapons to be far more problematic and unusable, and that's the reason why they have entirely given them up. And they also remain one of the key supporters of the Chemical Weapons Convention. In fact, you might remember that when Syria was forced to join the Chemical Weapons Convention and give up its chemical weapons, it was because the United States and Russia, who, by the way, were not agreeing on a lot of things, actually agreed on that one issue. On the bio issue, I think the situation is far more complex. Countries want to hold on to the capability, and this also gets a little bit into the patent issue that we know is coming up in the discussion even of vaccines. And countries don't necessarily want to have intrusive verification of their labs, and particularly of the corporate sector as well. But the downside of that, which we've seen, is that if we don't do that, we can be in this situation which we find ourselves right now, which is that you really have either rogue actors within these powerful states which are taking the lead, but also others who who might, for example, in the military or others, right, who might have access to this or might be able to weaponize these viruses in different ways. I know I've partly answered that question, but I know we can go on for much longer. But just in the interest of time, I'm going to take up a couple more questions in that sense. So a question is how can we find non-hegemonic partners? Well, I would actually say, look at the countries which have actually put together the first General Assembly resolution on how we might deal with COVID-19. Many of these actors are the ones which are very supportive of multilateralism and the United Nations, and they include countries as varied as Singapore, as Switzerland, as some of the Nordic countries as well, which are equally concerned about trying to deal with this particular situation as well. Again, in the interest of time, two more very interesting questions. How do we know if a bio attack was intentional? Would it only be possible if somebody claimed it? Well, this is the thing. One thing that COVID-19 has shown us is we don't even know when an attack would begin, right? So the first thing we need to do is get the detection right. And the better our detection capabilities, the better will be our ability to recognize where the attacks have actually even come from. But without that kind of a capability, that is really going to be problematic as well. In the interest of time, I'm going to take one last question, and this is a very good question about synthetic biology. Well, synthetic biology, as the name suggests, is really in some ways a combination in some ways of bio as well as the chemical capabilities as well. And we haven't seen this, we're starting to see this now, but the ability to actually create viruses and biotoxins without living material and using, other kind of material, particularly chemistry, is a big concern and is a growing concern. The suggestion made by the questioner that can the OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, adopt to cover this space is a very good one. It's something that obviously the OPCW would have to reach, would have to explore a little bit more and to see how they might build up that capability. But the bottom line is that this is going to remain an important issue for all of us. And frankly, both the negotiations and both the Biological Weapons Convention, as to some extent, even the Chemical Weapons Convention, are really playing catch up. The technology is moving much faster than we can possibly anticipate. And that is why we actually need these combinations of non-hegemonic states, of industry, of private sector, of labs, and of individuals who are experts in this area, and of course, academia. With that, let me bring this particular discussion and this pop-up course to an end by thanking all of you, not because we have concluded on a lot of things, but simply to say that this is the start of a conversation. Please reach out. You'll see in the chat the upcoming pop-up courses, but also our email as well as my bio. So in case you wanted to reach out, please feel free to do that. This is going to be an ongoing conversation, and I very much look forward to engaging with all of you on this. And thank you very much again for joining us and for your excellent set of questions, many of which we will in fact be answering on our course. So if you can, do join up the course as well. It is being offered in the fall. Thank you very much, and please stay safe and well. All the best. Bye for now.